Welcome, everybody. We're here once again for MSP Confidential, and I'm very pleased to have a special guest this week in Brian Guenther of Exceed Cyber. Brian, welcome to the live stream. How have you been, man?
I'm doing great, Luis. Thank you so much for having me today.
It really is a pleasure, and there's been so many conversations in the last little while that I've been having around compliance. I think everybody's having the conversations around compliance. It's becoming a very prescient topic for many in MSP, and I wanted to just explore some of these things with you. We put the topic for this week. We called it the MSP compliance journey, and I think that's quite broad potentially. And so maybe we can get into some specifics today, of course. But I wanted to maybe start with a bit of your backstory and maybe if you started in IT and then landed in cyber compliance and how that all actually worked out.
Sure. Yeah, happy to give a little bit of a quick backstory here, right? The origin story, as it were. But yeah, I started in the IT space about probably 26 years ago now, which is hard to believe, right? When I was younger and better looking. And during the time, like a lot of us, right? We started kind of in the trenches, building PCs, doing help desk, and everybody, like all of us, worked our way up and got more certifications along the way. And along the way comes, of course, the concern around how to protect the customer, right? So cybersecurity becomes a kind of a side dish, but for us, it became more of a major side dish and eventually became a main dish, right? So about 5, 6 years ago, we as an organization decided to pivot much more heavily into the information security space to help protect our clients in more in earnest than just as a firewall and EDR kind of solution, right? And then just a few years back, probably 3 or 4 years ago, that's when we pivoted more heavily into the compliance side.
Yeah. What got you thinking about the compliance and the pivot, so to speak? Because I think it's a pretty heavy lift from the discussions I've had for people to just kind of say, oh, we're just going to go over here now. So there must have been a bit of a trajectory or thinking behind the scenes kind of guiding you a little bit through the process.
Sure, great question. So really what it was is kind of the advent when we found out about this thing called CMMC coming out. And for those who are unaware of what that is, or for the uninitiated, it's essentially the U.S. Department of Defense requirement around having their defense contracting organizations safeguard their data, protect their what's called controlled unclassified information or federal contract information, right? FCI or CUI, if you will. And that was announced about, let's say, 5-ish years ago. Was sort of the first version of CMMC. Stands for Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification, again, about safeguarding government or DoD data. Because essentially foreign adversaries were eating our lunch and essentially stealing information left and right and taking away our competitive advantage, but also then impacting our national security, right? The US's national security. And so the DoD stepped in and said, you know what? We've had these cyber requirements and contracts for many, many years actually already. However, what we're finding in these spot checks by the Inspector General of the DoD, what they found was nobody was implementing them. So that's where CMMC came in, which is really, it's misunderstood, right? I want to give a little bit of a backstory here. It's misunderstood that the belief is in the industry that, oh, you're foisting all these requirements on us that are new. That's not true. Those requirements had been around for years before CMMC even became a name. What it really is not making sure, not implementing having implement controls of defense contractors implementing controls, but what it really is making sure you did the things you were already supposed to do. That's really what CMMC is. So that's really where it all began for us. We went through various iterations, and as such, that's kind of where we're at today. We'll talk about that a bit more later, I'm sure.
Yeah, I think the iterations are almost obviously in the details because there's a lot of things that change with any of the frameworks. And in fact, there was just the CMMC final rule, which you were telling me a little bit about. And I'm a novice as far as the details of some of these compliance frameworks and what they mean for the broader market in general. But I wanted to maybe touch on CMMC a little bit because what was happening with CMMC that this sort of final rule determination was coming out? What was the evolution or changes that were kind of leading up to it?
Yeah, a couple major things that came out were that there's going to be a kind of a phased rollout, and that was already expected, but there was more definition around the phased rollout of the CMMC requirements. Again, just to be very clear, these are defense contractor firms, right? So they're firms that create either sell a service or a product in what's called the defense supply chain, also called the defense industrial base, often used interchangeably. And those organizations had to, have to implement cybersecurity controls. Now, the rollout of these controls, and there's about 110 of those if you have to protect CUI, controlled unclassified information, was a pretty major piece, right? Heavily contested, heavily argued, what's going to change, lots of sort of like jockeying around what's going to happen. Is this even going to go live? Oh, we think this requirement's going to be dropped and so and so. And there's been a lot more definition around it now that the final rule went public on October 11th, so exactly 3 weeks ago, they dropped the final rule. And now it's in place. And so now everybody knows what the requirements are. The major changes for our audience here, because this is an MSP focused, podcast or webinar, is quite simply, and it was a major change, is that the MSP itself no longer must be compliant and certified at the same level as the organization seeking certification. And that's a term that's used for defense contractors, right? That was the case previously, but that requirement was dropped. And I'm sure a lot of MSPs breathed the proverbial that sigh of relief, like, oh my God, I thought I was going to lose that customer. Now I'd have to get compliant. It's going to cost me a ton of money, complexity, all that stuff. So
Mhm.
those are some major changes. Again, like I said, also definition around clarification of assessment levels of requirements, phase implementation timeline, and enhanced definitions around what CUI actually is and what that means to those organizations.
Yeah. So obviously a lot of detail there. And one of the things you and I were talking about backstage a little bit was this idea that perhaps this exclusion of the CMMs or the MSPs needing to be certified, as you were describing, perhaps gives a wider scope of opportunity to the market at large to sort of jump in and be like, oh, well, this means maybe more people have the opportunity to go and start doing some compliance. But it kind of harks back to a bit of the topic we are talking about. You don't just start doing compliance necessarily,
Mhm.
and it got us talking a bit about this interesting adjacency, as I called it, between IT and compliance. And you were very eloquently explaining to me, compliance is not necessarily about IT. It just happens to have a lot of things that can be solved with IT. But let's talk about this adjacency between compliance and IT, because I think for the average small business, maybe it starts with a security questionnaire from a vendor. Maybe it starts with FTC safeguards or some regulatory thing that comes down from their particular industry. The MSP is always going to get the thing dropped in their lap to kind of be like, hey, can you fill this out and answer this or take care of this? And there's an interesting maybe delegation of duties that happens traditionally between small business and IT. But compliance kind of requires to pull in the client a lot more. Their involvement is much higher. Their understanding of the processes and even frameworks that they might have to stand up internally to support a program like this are a lot deeper. And so let me summarize a bit. There's like 10 questions in there, but the first one
That's fine. Keep going.
the first one is, do you think this presents a real opportunity for more MSPs to sort of come down into the compliance market or up into the compliance market and pursue things like CMMC, which we know is a big deal in the US in particular? Or is it maybe a commoditization, perhaps, of compliance based on the final rule and some of the exclusions there?
Sure. So let's start with sort of the basics, right? Let's talk a little bit about what is compliance anyway, right? Let's talk about that. Compliance, just to kind of boil it down to the bare essentials, is effectively a requirement by some outside force, right? So consider it either a contractual, legal, or regulatory compliant requirement to do something of some sort that has to then be attested to or proven by sometimes an outside party, right? Or either self-attestation or certification, third-party audit, something like that, right? In this case, we're talking about specifically cybersecurity compliance. Just to be clear, right? There can be other types of compliance. It could be operational compliance requirements. It could be financial compliance, for example, SEC. But we're not talking about that part. We're talking really about the protection of the data using cybersecurity controls, right? So just kind of create a frame around this, first of all. And the question you asked is, does this create an opportunity for MSPs to move up into a compliance space and create more value with their relationship for the customer? And the short answer is yes. I think it does. Because look, the reality is, if you yourself are just an MSP, and I don't mean to denigrate anybody on this call, just want to be very clear, but if you're an MSP, I think, frankly, worse if you're in a break fix position, right? But if you're an MSP, you have monthly recurring revenue, you've got certain services you're billing for, perhaps some level of protections in place. Consider how you're differentiating yourself from the competition. How are you different? You have a relationship with them. They probably know, like, and trust you, right? But how are you really different from the competition? You're really only one problem away from being replaced. So how do you make yourself stickier? There's a variety of ways to do that as well, right? But if you have a conversation with your client now, let's say you do regular quarterly business reviews, which we do regularly, and you start talking with them about business outcomes and challenges and requirements that are potentially foisted upon them from outside parties, now you have their attention. Now you're a consultant and advisor, not just a, let's call it a commoditized MSP or IT service provider. And again, not to take anything away from your relationship. So hopefully that partially answers your question.
Yeah, and nothing against plumbers, but I label that level of involvement, the plumbing of the technology of the business. And much like electricity, it's at the point now where just people expect the IT to work. And so
Yeah.
just delivering, what we have known for as core service delivery for a long time, and maybe an area where MSPs could differentiate at some point, is long gone, in my opinion. I wanted to ask you about this because the operational muscle of compliance. And I think a lot of people that I talk to have maybe had a false start, saying, I'm interested in compliance. I'm going to have a look at this. And there's two layers. One, doing it for themselves, starting your own compliance journey, which I'd love to get into a little bit more. And
Mhm.
secondly, obviously doing it for customers. And one of the things that is so obvious to me is that we still have a lot of baggage from the VAR days, if you will, of like, I'm going to wait until a customer raises their hand and says they need compliance, and I'm just going to go and sell them compliance and figure it out as we go. And it's
Sure.
problematic because, again, the operational muscle of compliance, I think, is very different. And I wanted to speak a little bit to that muscle, so to speak.
Yeah. So, first of all, the idea as to do we even offer compliance services is really, first of all, it's a decision point, right? But then you have to figure out, well, what compliance services are we offering, right? They're not all the same. Some of them may be sort of relatively, let's call it low-hanging fruit. Do we help with PCI DSS, right? For payment card industry, for credit card processing? Do we help there? Do we help with HIPAA? Which HIPAA, for me, I'll be honest, don't love HIPAA because I don't love doctors and, the whole God complex thing. That's a personal decision. But we can get into sort of like something a little more complex, still lower level FTC safeguards, which is an expansion of the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act, right? That came out about a year-ish ago, and that requires anybody that's processing any consumer financial data, any organization that does that, to be compliant and fall under that. There's very specific requirements. And then you can move a little more upstream, right? And you can go into a framework like CIS version 8.1, Center for Internet Security, which has different implementation groups. You can now decide, okay, do I want to have my customer implement a standardized framework of security controls that allow them to attain, again, different iterative levels, or let's call them iterative and
Progressive.
build upon,
Yeah.
right? Progressive. That's a great word. Yep. Layers of security. Is it something that they're interested in? Do they have the desire to do that? I have found generally most business owners, and certainly on the smaller side, let's say under 100 employees, right? Most business owners, they can't really be bothered unless they have to do something. So one of two things happens when compliance, and let's say compliance through the lens of security, comes into place. One of them is they have been hacked, ransomed, they had a business email compromise, wire fraud, something happened, right? And they said, oh shit, that a wake up call, right?
Mm.
And they're like, oh crap, we can't keep doing what we did. We just got hosed majorly, and maybe their insurance didn't pay out, right? Because let's face it, they didn't have any security controls in place. So why would the insurance carrier pay, right? That stuff happens. Or in this case of compliance, again, handed down from above, maybe through a vendor risk assessment or perhaps a supply chain requirement, right, from a third party. Hey, we need you to be ISO 27001 compliant. We have to have you be compliant and be certified and show us that you're certified. Or you're in the defense supply chain. Now it's the federal government telling you that through your contracts you sign with them. Hey, listen, you are attesting to and certifying that you're compliant and have all these controls in place and policies and procedures, and all this can be proven. And now that's another conversation, right? So whether it's sort of a lower level or really is business impactful from the top down and is pushing down very hard on you from above, you may not have a choice. It could be as little as HIPAA, which, let's just be honest, HIPAA is barely enforceable, right? Or barely enforced, whereas CMMC is going to have a high level of enforceability. So, and everything in between.
Hmm. Well, seldomly enforced is a very different conversation than that changes as soon as insurance gets involved after an incident or something like that happens. And one of the conversations that I've heard a lot about lately is that even if the customer was not required to be compliant or attest to some framework, their industry perhaps doesn't need it, or
Mhm.
there's no regulatory body saying you have to do it, the insurance providers may still be more lenient and friendly to a client or a situation where the MSP was at least following best practices. Have you seen this sort of in the wild yourself? This leniency, so to speak, for at least deploying or adhering to a baseline of standards?
Yeah, so it's a great question. Depends. So the conversation around insurance is one that I want to kind of talk about with like, sort of a little bit out the side of my mouth, right? But also in terms of it is important to understand that insurance companies, first of all, like any business, right? Unless you're a nonprofit, they're in business of making a profit, right? And the reality is, whether it's your customer, whether it's you as an MSP, what's critical to understand is, first of all, what type of insurance policy do you have? We can get into the weeds on that, but I don't think it's necessary right now. But what's really, really critical is understanding that insurance carriers write their policies, create exclusions and exceptions in their policies, but also it's all based on underwriting based on your application and what you said during the application process. So let's fast forward maybe 6 months or a year, whatever. There was an incident, there was an exfiltration of data, or maybe perhaps money was stolen or ransom occurred. Something happened that made you file a claim. So what do you do now? You go to the carrier, you go to your broker, they go to the carrier, they file a claim, they go in, the carrier comes in, they do an investigation. That investigation is not to benefit you, it's to benefit them, to make sure they can try to kind of sneak out of it, right? And get away from paying. And if they find that either you, and we'll talk about subrogation. Do you know the term subrogation? We'll talk about
Hmm.
that in a minute. So if they find that the customer perhaps, is can be covered, right? Let's just say that everything was relatively in line and their application was maybe filed years ago and wasn't very, didn't have a tight level of requirements and they pay out, they may be going after someone else. That someone else is the MSP, right? And that's what's called subrogation, where an insurance carrier can go after other potentially responsible parties. And if you didn't raise the level of protection or security with your customer, they can now come after you.
Yeah, and this is
So,
where I hear folks like Brad Gross, a lawyer who's very much focused on the MSP industry, talk about how MSPs kind of put themselves in that pickle by the way they advertise on their website or by the way they don't put the necessary exclusions in a contract. And so this subrogation becomes a real issue if you're not paying attention to all the dots and the T's. So interesting challenge. There's
for
the
sure.
common people make that it seems like insurance has done more for the cybersecurity industry, raising its standards than government or any regulation have in the past. But what's your take?
It's certainly created a heightened level of awareness, right? I think that's fair to say. Like with anything, right? The insurance industry has been known to push forward and drive the adoption of new technology, right? And it was no different than with automobiles is a great example. Back in the day, in the 40s, 50s, 60s, the glory days of the automobile, the building out of the interstate, the Eisenhower interstate highway system, right? Building that across the US. People were going faster in cars that didn't have seatbelts. They crash. I mean, the likelihood of somebody would die or get severely injured was pretty high. So what then happened? Well, the insurance industry eventually said they learned about this new invention called a seatbelt. Well, what does that do? Well, it reduces the number of fatalities or potential bad injuries that insurance companies have to pay out for. So you see where this is going, right? Moves on further down the line in the 1980s, you had airbags and you had anti-lock brake systems, all of which side curtain, all of these things reduce the number of fatalities. And again, I hate to speak in grotesque terms, but you know what I mean. I'm just making an example. But the insurance industry drove that change through adoption of technology. And ultimately, what did they do? They went to state and federal legislature, state legislatures especially, and they got laws passed. And those laws required seatbelt in the cars, seatbelt usage, wearing seatbelts, click it or ticket, right? Remember that campaign?
Yeah.
That was a big thing. And so this with cybersecurity is really no different because about 4 to 6 years ago in this time frame, and COVID really went just escalated, just took off, is that the insurance carriers were getting hosed. And with cyber attacks going through the roof, right? Cyber attacks were way up, they went through the roof. And what was happening is you had these insurance carriers with poorly written agreements that were paying through the nose. And now they said no more. And they changed it and they required new applications to be filled. Those applications went from 1 page to like 5 or 10 pages, much longer. And think about that. Your requirement to comply and what often happened I'll wrap in a second there, but what often happened is that you had these the insured, right? The company, the business owner, you're the MSP's customer, often getting these applications saying, "Oh, I think we do that. Check, check, check. Yes, 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 yes." Filling these things out, only to find out later when they had a problem, those things were not actually being done. So
Right.
therefore, the insurance carrier would deny the claim. And so that's what you're seeing more of today. But all these changes, this came from the insurance industry. So yes, you're absolutely right, but that's the backstory.
Yeah, and speaking of adjacent industries, insurance is interesting because even during my time as an MSP owner, at one point we started to see insurance companies aligning or acquiring their own cybersecurity practices to some extent. And part of their renewal process now included doing, a vulnerability scan. And perhaps it was just external in nature, your domain, your email, the usual things that can be scanned externally, but then providing a report to the client on renewal about potentially all the concerns that they had. And some of
Mm.
it is a little bit of a fear tactic and scare tactics because they'd send a list of CVEs that the customer has no way of understanding what this all relates to, but a list of CVEs because some Apache program in their website was maybe had some, vulnerability or something like that. But it created a lot of interesting conversations between clients and their MSPs. Like, what the
Yeah.
hell is this, first of all? And, shouldn't you be taking care of this? And why is this currently all red? Um, and so
Mhm.
that's one example. But the other example that I see more to the process of getting clients to a compliance discussion is that, for example, we see ERP companies or CPAs or other adjacent industries that are already in the boardroom at a very strategic level with customers suddenly get handed the reins of IT. Be like, well, it seems to you know a lot about this. Can you just look after our IT as well? And we're seeing more of this. We see ERP companies buying MSPs. We see CPAs buying MSPs, and then just doing basically the plumbing with the MSP side of the business, but a lot of the strategy with what they're already doing at the accounting level and so on. And so it kind of struck me as an interesting parallel with compliance in that if MSPs are not doing compliance, in comes some big player that is doing compliance. And SOC 2 is a good example because a lot of accounting firms are the ones doing the auditing for SOC 2 attestation, right?
Mhm.
And
Yep.
they might just eat your lunch while they're in the process of, in a relationship with the customer at a very strategic level. And so my question is really, have you seen some of this play out in the wild? And obviously, you're now a little bit more strategic and working with customers at the boardroom level. But where do MSPs really need to pay attention here?
Yeah, that's an awesome tee up, and that's not meant to be a tee up, but it's an awesome question to be posed, which is about are you aware who's in your backyard, right? Who's like lurking in front of your house, essentially looking to walk in and take your stuff, essentially. And think of your stuff as your customers, right? And so we kind of talked early on a little bit about commoditization and how MSPs or IT service providers are really, if you compare them side by side, are fairly heavily commoditized, right? They more or less do the same thing. It's hard to differentiate yourself from that. Aside from the relationship, it's hard to differentiate yourself. How are you different, right? You kind of were similarly priced, do similar services, similar stack, right? We're kind of all the same, right? How are you different? And the way to differentiate yourself and to really keep the other guys out of your backyard is by doing one of two things. Either you decide, hey, we're going to fulfill that service in-house, whether it's become an MSSP, do the full security stack, and or level up and say, you know what, we'll do the compliance work as well. We'll figure that out. This is where you're having conversations again around risk management and first of all, understanding who the risk owner is. Let's have that conversation really quick too, right?
Hmm.
You as the MSP, I want to make sure this is very clear, are not the risk owner. I'll say it again. You're not the risk owner. Okay. The customer is. However, the conversations you've been having with them, and I say very broadly you, I don't mean everyone here that's listening, is that it's almost like you're going and saying, look, we got to put this piece in, this piece in, this will protect you. It's kind of selling a point solution, which is not a great idea because now you're not creating a comprehensive solution. But in the end, the customer has to decide how to manage their risk. That's up to them. You're there to present the risk. They have to manage in some way or another. Okay. So I'm going to be very clear about that because oftentimes I've talked to MSP owners who are like, oh, I'm really worried about my customer not doing these things. I'm like, then make it very clear that it's not your risk. It is not yours. Make sure they sign a risk acceptance letter, things like that. Right. And so let's talk about compliance for a second, right? You talked about the boardroom, CPA firms, other firms that are coming in. By the way, CPA firms, they're entry, if you will, into the IT space or the IT server space in the 80s and 90s was very organic because they already did the financial stuff. They had the taxes, they did accounting. Now spreadsheets came out, right? Then I had to support those systems and processes. Nobody knew how to do that. So a lot of CPA firms kind of came to that space very organically. So those still exist, right? But there's a lot more, what do we now call MSPs out there. So just to kind of wrap this piece of the conversation real quick, the MSP itself, if you raise your level of conversation, having strategic, high level, boardroom level conversations that are focused on outcomes and business requirements, you've now made yourself consultant and far, far more difficult to replace. Okay. And
Mm.
compliance is a big part of the conversation. What do those requirements look like? So I said earlier, you can either do it yourself, right? Do your compliance work, do the compliance work for the customer, and just to be clear, that's not technical in nature. That's usually policies, documentation, process, right? Creating project managing them through, creating a compliance program, tracking all that, gathering artifacts, making sure those are all there so those can be audited later by a third party if and when required. So when you're doing that, you make yourself inherently stickier to the customer. So either you do it yourself or you bring in a partner that will stay in their swim lane, like Exceed, like us, for example, who says, you know what, we're here to support and lift up the MSP. So you've got
Mm.
choices. But don't leave it to chance to have the competition, if you will, come in the back door and eat your lunch.
Let's talk about resilience for a minute, because I do seem to detect a slight shift in the narrative or the topic or the focus away from securing to becoming resilient. And perhaps it's, the data is kind of making us do that. Microsoft puts out breach reports, Verizon puts out breach reports, and the stats are pretty staggering and scary. The percentage of businesses that will have an incident this year or next year, it pretty much includes everybody. And so it seems that there's a pivot happening away from securing the organization to making the organization more resilient. Um, how does compliance play a role in resiliency, I guess, is the question. And do you see businesses maybe attaching better to the idea of resiliency over security? Or what's been your experience there?
I'll just be very frank with you. To me, those are really two separate things, right? Protecting the organization and having a compliant organization, depending on whatever is being foisted upon you from a level, again, the tier above through regulation, for example, like CMMC, which, as a sidebar, is really only concerned about the confidentiality of the data that you're meant to protect, not necessarily the integrity or the availability. It's called the CIA triad in information security management, right? Really only confidentiality. And so just because you have compliance in place, let's just take FTC safeguards, kind of a fairly low to mid-level compliance requirement that's meant to safeguard the customer's data. That's why the FTC is behind it, right? They're the enforcers. Now, do they have enforcers that are knocking on your door or knocking on the business's door and checking in on them? Maybe they're doing spot checks. The problem, of course, comes in if you or your client, especially, gets popped, as we call it, right? Has an incident, right? Data exfiltration or something happens, they now have a requirement to for breach notification, right? And they have to announce that this happened, not just to the FTC, but also to their customers. And there's very serious penalties now, in some extreme cases, criminal, but generally there are civil and financial penalties involved. Now, that's a fairly low level of compliance that's centered around safeguarding data. It's called cybersecurity, right? Broadly. And that's a very different conversation from having a high level protection like CMMC maturity level 2. You have 110 controls, right? Seems daunting, right? That's a ton. Oh my God, where do I begin? Um, and with that kind of requirement, you got to keep in mind that it's about the confidentiality of the data. It doesn't mean that your business will necessarily continue. It doesn't mean that your data is always going to be available. And I just want to be sure everybody listening who doesn't know much about compliance understands that cybersecurity compliance is not necessarily, doesn't equate to security itself. Security is always about layers, right? It's called layered defense or defense in depth or layered security to make sure if something happens and you have a defense that breaks, you have another layer below that that will take over and protect you. So I can go on about that, but I'll pause for a second.
No, it's an important distinction, and I think these are all important things that MSPs need to and should be thinking about. Back in the summer at Exchange Security, one of the channel companies events, They had Ted Harrington, who's a white hack with security evaluators. And they work with big organizations. They kind of do an in-depth security evaluation of where some of the potential um, weaknesses are in the business where security is concerned or cybersecurity is concerned. And during the Q&A at the end, I mentioned, what role does he think a white hat plays in the legal infrastructure of this, or just overall in the industry? And he said, my opinion is that the legality or the legal enforcement of these things is always going to be 10 years behind the technology. And I think it's kind of a scary thing to think about, because surely enough, like the CMMC final rule, maybe we'll end up with another CMMC final rule and final rule 3.0. And like, it's going to keep evolving because the technology has been changing so much that the controls no longer suit the requirements. And so it was interesting that the comment that he made in follow up to that was that one of the biggest opportunities he saw was to get away from the conversation of security point solutions. And you just mentioned that a moment ago as well, because every security point solution is another conversation about a different, spend potentially in the eyes of a small business who may be budget conscious and all that, where compliance kind of brings everything under the umbrella of the conversation of, hey, these are the things that we need to do, and understanding what tolerance the business has or the business owner has to any kind of risk. And whether they want to pursue those things just as a frame of mind, generally speaking, or not. But I wanted your thoughts on legislation, the whether that will be enough to get more and more people doing what I would say or call the right thing to do. But yeah, your thoughts on that.
Sure. Yeah. I'll start off with this. You might find this a little funny, but I'm pretty direct. And I also always engage every conversation with a prospect or a client with the intent of helping them, right? It's always my intention. And I always go into conversation about, helping them first, and then the money will follow. If I take care of the customer, in the end, it'll all pan out. And part of the discussion I'm having with defense contractor clients, especially smaller ones, right? And say maybe they're under 50, is I have very strategic questions that I ask them to sort of figure out. Now, I ask them, like, what's your revenue? What portion of that revenue is DoD? What portion of that revenue is contract based, and right now how much of that is current? How much of that is renewing? Talk to me about the margin on that, right? And so what I'm really trying to get to here is understanding if they have enough business. For example, again, this is CMMC, DoD contractors, whether the work they get from the DoD, based on the work they receive, the top level revenue, the work they receive, the percentage of the work, and the margin on that work, whether it even makes sense to enter into this, right? Because you could spend $100,000 to $150,000 if you have CUI, and you have to be what's called maturity level 2 certified, by a third party, by the way. It could be that much. Does that make sense for you? Right? So we're now having a business level discussion. It's really financially focused first, and having that discussion, which may seem anathema to progress, but really, for me, I really like to start there first. They're like, yeah, we sell $100,000 to DoD every year. Our margin on that is 10%. We make 10K, and be like, I'll be 15 years to make that money back. That doesn't make sense, right? So again, I want to have that business discussion with them. So regarding whether there's an appetite to move forward with that, it all depends on what their focus is. Perhaps they're expanding more into those markets. There's so many different questions to be asked. And really, if you lead with curiosity with every conversation, saying, where are you going, right? What's your objective, right? Where have you been? Where are you going? Sort of that whole thing, right? And how can I help you get there? In some cases, I've told customers before, look, based on what you told me, it really wouldn't make sense for you to pursue this, because you're not looking to get more business from DoD. You're looking to just maintain. And that may be like literally a loser financially.
Interesting. And I guess this is where the other alternatives maybe start to play a role. Is the compliance mindset period the important thing? Never mind CMMC specifically, if they rule that out and say, it's not interesting for us to do that. It might now be difficult to sort of pull back and be like, oh, well, we still need you to do compliance because it's an important thing that we think is necessary for every business. And maybe now you're just down the hole of, oh, we're not interested. Well, we're not interested in that either. But maybe doing CIS is important because it still creates a layer or a baseline of security that's important for both the MSP, for insurance reasons, as we talked about earlier, but also for the business because it's the right thing to do. And so this is kind of the frustration maybe that a lot of people in the cybersecurity space seem to have, is that not enough people seem to be doing the motions because it's the right thing to do, and they're just kind of waiting to be legislated into action, so to speak. But that action may be too late, of course.
Yeah. Yeah. In some cases, again, let's just talk about CIS for a second, right? CIS, we talked about those being a broadly understood and accepted framework for cybersecurity with different implementation groups that you can sort of gradually iterate into, right? So let's talk about that. Like I said before, generally the requirement is that somebody is scared into action, right? They're moved into action, right? Object at rest stays at rest. Object in motion stays in motion, generally, right? So you got to get them into motion in some way or another. Um, let's talk about other compliance frameworks, right? There could be an organization that gets a vendor risk assessment from again, maybe a distributor or a customer that's upstream from them for whom they're a supplier, and they want to know that their supply chain, and this may be a manufacturing company making widgets, right? Perhaps they're making like little pins for, I don't know. I mean, we're not talking about a defense company now, but anything that they're making, that their upstream customer for who may be putting the product together and selling it, they're saying, hey, we're doing business international here. We want to make sure that all of our vendors in our supply chain are safeguarding their data, including our data, some of which may be IP, intellectual property, that we want to safeguard and protect, right? And that this processes and data is protected, can't just be stolen by anybody. Now, for example, one of those frameworks could be ISO 27001, which is, again, is internationally recognized cybersecurity framework. It is something that U.S. firms will ask for, especially at the international, but it's an international standard. They're based out of Switzerland. And so that may be more likely something you see. You maybe see it, like you said earlier, SOC 2, Type 1 or Type 2, which is done by the AICPA. Those are, auditors that are CPAs that are accredited to actually do the certifications. And a lot of software companies, and ScalePad being one of them, right? You probably have a SOC 2 certification, and many of them do. And that shows us that you have a modicum of security in place to safeguard your own data, have systems, processes, policies, and all those in place. And you've proven that you've done that. And as time goes on, more and more organizations, independent of legislation or regulation, will want to see that. Because what they don't want to have is when you have an attack that they are included in the blast radius,
Hmm.
right? They don't want to be in your blast radius. And that's a big piece of it. And they also don't want to necessarily have a business email compromise from somebody in your organization. I mean, there's various different case studies or use cases we could discuss here, but the reality is all about controlling risk. And all those organizations, whether it's a customer or a vendor, upstream supplier you're working with, that's going to become more common. It's not going away. It's going to become more common. And if you can position yourself as an MSP to say, for example, we will adopt CIS version 8.1. We're going to implement that. You will be in a better position, right? As will your customers.
Hmm. Do you feel it just kind of hit me that, like insurance for a long time, I feel like I always put people in two categories. They either believe in insurance or they don't. And it seemed to be like a character trait to some extent. And I wonder if compliance is going through that divisive character trait phase for the next little while. People either believe in it or they don't, because we're not, again, not legislated in many cases to do it. And so you kind of have to either believe in it or not believe in it. And it's kind of up to the MSP, I guess, to some extent, to evangelize it enough that the customer understands. And I'm starting to see more MSPs, draw the line in the sand as well. Be like, we're not interested in working with you unless this is a key part or program that you're willing to stand up as part of your
Mhm.
overall strategy. But your thoughts on the divisiveness of compliance?
I mean, look, it is a divisive topic because to your point, there's a certain personality type that doesn't want to be told what to do. And let's just be honest, right? A lot of business owners, if you're familiar with the DISC model, high D, dominant personality, right? Type A, high D, they have a certain characteristics and personality traits. Not all of them. I'm sure they're lovely people, but the reality is some people get into business because they had created an amazing product or service, and others got into business because they don't really want to work for anyone else, right? Could potentially be too difficult to work for. That being said, again, I'm not saying it's 50-50, but you will have business owners ultimately make that decision who fall on one side of the fence or not, right? Some may be more compliant, and I don't mean compliance, but more personality wise, fall into the compliance side of the house versus, yeah, you know what, we're not going to really worry about that so much. We'll get very basic insurance, and we'll kind of just, if the
Hmm.
worst thing happens, we'll just deal with it. But they don't really realize what the worst thing could be. That the worst thing is, again, a serious attack, an incident major data exfiltration or ransomware, they're shut down, they can't operate. I call it the death by a thousand paper cuts, that literally could put them out of business, right? And that's part of what I want to evangelize, and I often do when I talk to folks. And it's really, really tricky because what you don't want to do is talk to them about this topic and make them feel scared to where you're the one creating the fear, right? Do you see where I'm going with this?
Mm.
You don't want to be the one that's perceived as creating the fear. You want to say, here's what's going on, documentable evidence. I want to give you examples thereof. And here's what we recommend you do, right? And that recommendation would be you have to have a really good standalone cyber liability policy, by the way. You may want to even have a directors and officers insurance policy to protect your executive leadership team. Independent of that, you should really put in place all these different safeguards to protect your company. Again, technical controls, right? Policies, process. And that's not compliance based. This is really securing your organization that if the worst thing does happen, your insurance will pay, right? You're going to get actually paid out, and you're not just going to have like wasted premiums. They will pay out and your business continues. You can't avoid every attack, but what you can do, again, is minimize the blast radius and the explosiveness of the event.
Yeah. And this is kind of why I brought in the resiliency topic, because I think that's where if clients at some point feel pinned against the wall, and the reality or the perception they have is that they're going to get attacked anyways, they're going to have an incident anyways, and why bother? And people
Yeah.
do take that position, which is, I think, the scary piece. And I think it's just a tool in the toolkit for the MSP to be able to connect all these issues together. It's not just about the security and the controls. It's also about the ability to recover from an incident.
Absolutely.
And I think all those things play a role. And by recover, I don't mean just technically. I mean also because the insurance paid, and they were willing to pay because you had the necessary controls or aligning to best practices. And so, like, it's all an intermingled web of requirements and dependencies that is becoming more and more important to pay attention to. Um, Man, there's so many parts of this that are clearly the psyche of the relationship between the provider and the client, and how to make that work really well. I was curious if you're willing to share. You might say, you know what, this is the thing that we're specialists at, and I'm not willing to share, but I'll ask anyways. What have you found are conversations or pivots or focuses that are really effective with clients in helping them understand the bigger picture for the need of compliance? And I maybe want to exclude CMMC because that there's a hard requirement
Yeah.
to do that in certain situations. But for some of the things that are perhaps optional in some of the industries.
Sure. Typically, we're talking about contractual requirements. Let's just talk about FTC safeguards, because most folks that are watching today, if they're MSPs, have heard about FTC safeguards. That's a really good one to talk about. And what you really want to do is draw a fine line, or not draw a fine line. You want to be as, again, educational as possible. It's always critical to lead with education first. You don't want to sell with fear, because fear mongering is never well received, like I said before. So having a conversation with a client, let's just call it an accounting firm, right? Because an accounting firm will probably have some modicum of consumer financial data, or even a financial advisory firm. There's another one, right? Even though they're governed by the SEC, right? Securities Exchange Commission versus the FTC, there's some overlap there. But anybody that's in that business should know and does know that the data they hold has some level sensitivity. And it starts with, again, a QBR. If you're doing those, by the way, big fan of Lifecycle Insight, just a big shout out to ScalePad here. If you're doing QBRs and doing those regularly, you shouldn't be reviewing tickets. You should be talking to them about problems, growth, focus, issues, right? Strategy and that kind of stuff. And that's really where that time to lean into this conversation. You did your regular banter and say, all right, listen, now I want to talk about something that's really important. And that is this. Have you ever heard of this before, FTC safeguards? Do you know what it is? Do you know it's an expansion Gramm-Leach-Bliley? Only used to apply to banks and credit unions. Now it applies to all kinds. It's a big old dragnet. But here's why it matters to you. Here's why it should matter to you. And what you don't want to find yourself in is a position where you don't implement controls or policies and you have an incident, and now you're not only in trouble because you had a major loss internally, financial or data or otherwise, right? You have a reputation damage, you may have an insurance problem, but you also have a regulation problem as well, right? We're not talking about CMMC. They're going to now come, all of those different sides coming down on you. And think about the potential for survivability. If you go into that conversation with I'm here to help, I'm here to educate. And this reminds me real quick, I want to just throw this in there because my dear friend Amir Sachs, who is Blue Light IT, he's in Florida, he's in Boca Raton, great friend. He says, I have a superpower. I'm like, what's the superpower? He said, I can turn a room of business executives into ostriches. How do you do that? He said, I just enter the room. I say, you're all going to get hacked. And they go whoosh, head in the sand because that's what they do. The reality is they think it's not going to happen to me. What do I have to get? And if it does happen, no big deal, right? That's what you're fighting against. And you're also fighting back against this almost like a resignation of it's going to happen to me anyway. What can I do? The reality is you can do a lot because what you don't want to find out is when you do get popped, that you go out of business
Hmm.
because that's really what customers do care about. If you can convey that message independent of compliance, then you have their attention.
Yeah. And it sounds so easy to say in hindsight if you've mastered some of the skills and conversation tactics to do that successfully. But I think it's interesting that maybe one of the things preventing MSPs from doing this more is just simply the commoditized aspect of where their business has landed over the years. And I think this is a real challenge. You know, they're often not even in front of that level of person to have that conversation in the first place. Maybe they were
Mhm.
because that person was going to sign the check to their MSA in the first place. But the reality is that the conversation later just kind of devolved a little bit into, you know, the office manager or the person kind of responsible for
Yeah.
IT or gathering all the issues and sending them, you know, a big email every day or
Their
every
point
week.
of contact.
Yeah, their point of
Yeah.
contact. And so this is obviously a challenge. And I think one of the conversations I had with Chris Jensen, an enterprise CIO, came on the live stream a couple months ago, and I asked him the question, you know, have you found that if the conversation was very operational in nature, very tactical in nature, that it was easy to sort of come back to a strategic level conversation? And he said it was very difficult to do. And so this is, I think,
Yeah.
where it's incumbent on MSPs to get in strategically and then stay there strategically, because as soon as you sort of drop down to the operational tactical level, it's going to be really difficult to reestablish a bit of those conversations. The other challenge, and I think this is where the concept of consultant or advisor comes into play. And I want to ask you this question.
Mhm. Sure.
Um, I think for the average MSP who's under 10 people and work with clients often in the 30, 50, 100 people in size, you know, the average 100-person business owner might look at the 10-person business owner and be like, what do you have to teach me about running a 100-person business? And because a lot of the
Mm.
compliance stuff, a lot of the conversations are maybe process centric and organizationally driven. And so I'm curious about your experience there and just navigating a bit of that challenge.
Mm. Yeah, that's a really good question, right? So we can't really answer that question without talking a little bit about ego, right? Because business owners sometimes, can have an ego they carry with them. Sometimes they can't fit through the door, right? Because the ego is so big. But I take the approach of I can learn something from anyone. Am I willing to listen, right? And have that conversation. And I think it really comes down to, like you said before, if you're relegated to the office manager and that's who you're dealing with primarily, you kind of got abdicated, right? Really, they abdicated responsibility to somebody else because they don't want to deal with it. But you have to be able to have business level conversations with them, rather, with your client, especially about risk, and insisting that do it at least, I mean, quarterly, and if you can more often, especially if they're a larger customer, meeting with that owner and being there and just creating value. You can't really change their perception that they may have initially around what can you as a 10-person company tell me about a 100-person company. I know more than you. But that's kind of a shady attitude to have, frankly. And I would just sort of smile and say, okay, I understand what you're saying. But I assure you, there's things that we I can share with you. I can teach you. And it's not necessarily about me being a business advisor to them, but I do know more about what they do about IT operations, security, and compliance, and how that's going to help them create a competitive advantage. Let's talk about that for a second, right? If you line up all your ducks and put them in a row and now take, again, securitization of your organization more seriously, you become a more competitive player, right? Because now you may be going to market and saying, all right, we want to kind of bid for these contracts. What if they have security requirements on you and you've not met any of those?
Hmm.
You actually become a more competitive player. because you're more attracted to those because other organizations, sometimes larger than your 100-person organization, they're a 1,000-person organization, they do identify and measure risk. And they want to be sure that you are in a place where they can enter in a relationship with you and not have to worry about you.
Hmm. So on this risk conversation, and I think this is maybe one of the building blocks of starting your compliance journey. And I wanted you to perhaps verify the concept or idea, but it feels like it's the thing that most MSPs are doing to some extent casually today. They're assessing a little bit of risk. They're seeing, we need to replace this, we need to do that. And whilst a lot of those things are still somewhat commoditized, I think there is a conversation around risk that's happening all the time. And in a conversation with Dan Fox, our own internal subject matter expert on compliance, because we will be at a Team Nation next week. We're doing a breakout. We're doing a lunch and learn, all trying to get people more familiar with the process of becoming or starting the MSP compliance journey, so to speak. But one of the things that kind of came out from a framework or building block perspective was this idea of risk assessments. And that's the kind of thing you can do, obviously, in lifecycle insights or anything really that you're doing for managing your QBRs, which are mostly account management driven hardware infrastructure management, but still allow you to track risk in some way, shape, or form. Can you speak to risk assessments or risk assessing being a building block to the higher levels of compliance?
Absolutely. Risk assessments, frankly, are at the core of what we do. It's actually the first thing we do after, we have a very specific process. We have a first time appointment where we learn a little about the customer. We then have what's called a discovery call. We dig a little bit deeper. And part of it is really while they're interviewing us, we're also interviewing them, right? We want to be sure they're a good fit for us. We even want to take them on. We talk about budget, we talk about expectations. But one of the first things we do, the first engagement that we do is that we do a paid risk assessment and they are paid. And there's a very good reason for that. We want that prospective client to understand is that we want them, first of all, to pay for it because we want them to have skin in the game. Because if you give it away, like remember back in the day, everyone did free network assessments, had no value. People essentially expected it, they had no value whatsoever. The cybersecurity risk assessment is the evolution of that. But it's a different conversation when they pay for it. Now, if they're not willing to pay for it, why should I lean into that? But let's go beyond that, right? So that's just sort of my philosophy around it. Now, with the risk assessment, we uncover a lot. You talked earlier, sort of early in the conversation about CVEs. For those uninitiated here, common vulnerabilities and exposures, right? That's part of the MITRE attack framework. These are all logged. These are exposures within software or hardware that can be exploited in some way or another. So we can certainly go through them and do a risk assessment on their endpoints, on their firewall, on their server, even on their website, right? Up or in their email 365 and kind of collate that all together. And I apologize if my video is a little squirrely, right? But collate that and bring it all together and present that. And we do that. And what we find is when we do that with the entire leadership team, the owner of the leadership team, and we convey that in such a way, we make it fairly as objective as possible, but also score it. That's a big thing that we do differently than I think a lot of our contemporaries. We actually give them a score, almost like a credit score, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or you like maybe like a 350 to 850, right? 300 is awful and 850 is like as good as it can be. We want to give them the score so they know where they are. That risk assessment process is so important because that's when we show them what their risk is. When they see their risk and understand what can happen if and when, sorry, when not if, they have an incident and what their vulnerabilities are and their eyes open up, right? Is what we call the risk light bulb, right? When that happens, now you're having a different conversation. Either they get it or they don't get it. And if they don't get it, it's going to be really hard to convince them. I always joke and say, I don't want to be in the convincing business. I want to show you the data, give you hard facts and evidence. And then if that makes sense to you, perhaps we take the next step together, right? But the risk assessment is such a critical piece of that. And I do believe the customer should have financial buy-in to do so.
Well, I kind of don't want to be in the convincing business either. And let me maybe turn that right on its head and say to MSPs watching, I'm not here to try to convince you to start your compliance journey. I think the data is so clear and it's already there that I think you're doing yourselves and especially your customers a disservice to not try and align to some framework and try to start this journey and understand how it works. I think fundamentally, and we kind of touched on this only briefly, and maybe it's a good topic to end our conversation today on, is this idea of how different the work of compliance is compared to your typical day-to-day IT support, desktop, server, network management, and so on. Can you speak a bit to that? And I kind of framed it as maybe the operational muscle of compliance, but I think a lot is lost when MSPs realize, oh, geez, I didn't realize it was going to be this much work. And it's
Yeah,
mainly the work is just different. It's continuous.
it
It's
is.
never ending. It's this idea of projects versus programs. We love the rush of projects and being done with them. And a lot of the way we build MSPs is kind of focused around this idea of a revenue line that is project revenue. I'll hand that over to you to give me a bit of your thoughts on that.
Sure. Again, I could talk about this for a long time, but I want to keep it fairly succinct for the audience, right? You have to understand that again, and we've already, I think, painted that picture or that narrative today, that compliance is not the same as tech work. Our customers tend to kind of loop us, sort of put us into that container, that category of like, aren't you also the compliance guys? The short answer should be no. We don't do any compliance work for you. If they ever say that to you and say, we don't have any compliance relationship, and hopefully your contract, your MSA, and your statements of work clearly indicate that. If not, they should talk to people like there's a lot of people out there like Brad Gross or CRD Aston, Monger. All of those are like MSP focused law firms that can help you with that, right? To make have really good contracts. Have good contracts. I cannot emphasize that enough, right? Don't expose yourself to liability. Now, it takes a very different person, a very specific type of person that has a really if you're familiar with again the DISC profile, dominant, influencing, steadiness, and compliant, has a very kind of steady and compliance focused personality, right? That's really who they are. And they can kind of very clearly go methodically through these different steps along the way and guide the customer through what we call the compliance journey. We call it compliance as a service. They have nothing in place. We know they have nothing. We got to build the program, kind of lift them up. And
Mm.
just to be clear, that's not hands on keyboards, right? That's not fingers on keyboards. That's actually making sure the policies are written and that they're modified, that they're accepted by the business, that there's buy-in, that there's, again, procedures in place, and eventually working with the right people, let's say the MSP, to ensure that the technical controls are implemented as well, and that raises their standard of care. That compliance level must now be maintained going forward, right? It's a maintenance mode. You're not in kind of build mode. You're in maintenance mode going forward. And that, technically speaking, as long as they fall under that compliance, whether it's contractual, regulatory, or legal, will really never go away unless that requirement goes away. They have to maintain that going forward. And that should always be an additional cost, really, frankly, or something that the customer should pay for. I would never recommend like incorporating into your MSP services, just sort of building it in. You can, but I think it should stand apart because, frankly, it's a premium service, and very, very few MSPs have the capability to do that. So if you can do that, have the conversations, make it clear, understand why they need to lift up, and if they don't, they don't want to do it, just say, okay, understand, but always have a have a paper trail, right? That just said no.
Yeah, or partner with an organization. I
Or
understand you
partner with a
do.
company like us.
Yeah,
Yep,
yeah.
absolutely. Yeah, we can partner,
I,
and they may not want to partner with you because they may see you as just the MSP. And again, forgive the term, but it depends on whether you want to build it in house or if you want to bring it out, bring it in from outside.
Henry Tim put a comment, and he says, "You can't care more about your client's security or compliance than your client does." And it's so true, but it's also the biggest contradiction in the IT space, I think, is that we do, and that is the challenge, right?
Yes,
And so
a huge
how to
challenge. It's a
navigate,
big
yeah,
problem.
yeah, how to navigate that internally is such a big deal.
Mhm.
Well, Brian, what an insightful conversation. Thank you for all your experience and knowledge that you've been dropping bombs here the whole hour.
Sure.
I love the topic. There's clearly so much more work for the industry to do here, and I'd love to continue the conversation in some way, shape, or form. Perhaps we'll do an annual check-in at the very least to see how we've progressed and how the industry is advancing in this regard. But in the meantime, I invite you to connect with Brian if you're watching and you have questions about maybe partnering with a cyber compliance focused shop like his to see if there's maybe an opportunity to work together. And thank you so much for spending a few minutes of your Friday afternoon hanging out with me and chatting with folks here. And I hope you continue this great work.
Happy to do it. And for those who are here who want to learn a little bit more, want to have a conversation, you can connect with me on LinkedIn. I'm very reachable, so I'm happy to have a conversation. No expectations on my side. I'm just here to educate. But thank you very much, Luis. I appreciate your time as well. Thank you.
Awesome. Everybody else, thank you so much for joining us today. We're here every Friday at 12 noon, 3 p.m. Eastern. And we'll see you next week. I have Dominic Vogel coming on next week. We're going to chat about maybe some cybersecurity related things, but he's really an expert on team culture and dynamics. And this will be a fascinating conversation that I'm looking forward to. Once again, Brian, thank you so much. And we'll see everybody next week. Bye for now.
My pleasure.
And,
See you.
and
Take
Brian,
care.